Good day, and welcome to the last session on our history of theology and humor and satire. We've raced through so many different periods and so many different kinds of humor that this last session is going to focus on just two people. Now, there was an off-Broadway play called Freud's Last Session, in which an imaginary meeting was made for C.S. Lewis and Sigmund Freud, and they exchanged ideas. Steve Allen also kind of wrote a book called The Meeting of Minds. In The Meeting of Minds, he put together two people, lots of people, and they talked about different ideas. And so today what I'm going to do is have C.S. Lewis meet Stephen Colbert, probably one of the great Christian humorists of the 20th century, meeting one of the best of the 21st century. And both of them play the fool. And Lord, what fools these mortals be, as we'll see next. Now, I'm going to look at their similarities. Both of them share many common moments. In fact, one of the first things we find about them is both lost a parent when they were about 10 years old. For C.S. Lewis, his mother died of cancer, and it was a traumatic event that began to kind of shape his understanding of suffering in life. But next we see, too, that Colbert's father and two brothers, Peter and Paul, were killed in a plane crash. And he was one of many children, you see. They're good Roman Catholics. And he talks about the days following the death of his father and brothers. And he said, in our house, the shades were down, and his mother wore a lot of black. It was very quiet in the house, and she was a daily communicant at Mass. And many times he said, I was too, but it was a constant search for healing. And he said, my mother gave that gift to us all. I am so blessed, he wrote, to have been the child at home with her. So both of them went through this time of grief and suffering, which becomes a foundation for the kind of laughter that will come out of them. But next we find they're both outsiders to their environment as well, as both of them are Irish. So it's like an oxymoron that George Carlin talks about. Remember George Carlin's Jumbo Shrimp or Greater Cleveland, two words that don't fit. And so you have these Irish boys that really are out of place. Lewis was one in Oxford, an Irish boy in Oxford. But we look next and we find that Stephen Colbert, born in Charleston, South Carolina, which is kind of the Dublin of the South, moves to New York and then to Los Angeles. And so they're both outsiders. Next, both of them sought to escape school bullies. For Lewis, he was a boy who had no joints in his thumb and so couldn't enjoy sports. And he would hide out in the library and read. And he said, worst of all, there was my face. When I tried to look very humble, people thought I was looking insolent or truculent. And so I was in trouble no matter what kind of expression I'd put on my face. And next, like Lewis, Colbert wasn't too popular in his new schools. He said, I was beaten up on a regular basis. He wasn't one of your typical guys. And so he said, what I learned to do is not just want to dance, but he learned to use jokes. He learned to use humor. And for what it was worth, there's another short person here, your host, who had to use humor to survive during middle school as well. Now, next we find that they both found sanctuary in reading. As we mentioned about Lewis, he would escape the games and the bullies and the tarts by going to his library. And there he read book after book, particularly the Norse myths that he loved about Odin and Wotan and Balder the Beautiful. And so too, Stephen Colbert would read particularly books like Tolkien, based on the Norse myths. And he said, when I read books is to escape. It's so I don't have to talk to people. Now, next we find that as young men, both of them lost their faith at an early age. Both of them have conversion stories. The story of Lewis is the portrait of an Irish poet as a young atheist. He said he learned to be flippant. He learned to smoke. He learned to drink. He learned how to be fashionable. And his dancing mistress kind of stirred red hot blood in him when he looked at her and what she taught. And so he began to give up whatever faith he had. He became a Freudian. He became an atheist. And he began to kind of have that post-World War I sense of angst and uncertainty about life. Next, we find, though, however, he started reading people like George MacDonald and G.K. Chesterton. And he wrote in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, that a young man who wishes to remain a sound atheist cannot be too careful of his reading. There are traps everywhere in that literature. Or as George Herbert, the great poet, wrote, Bibles are laid open, millions of surprises, fine nets and strategies of God to capture us. The hound of heaven is after us. And Lewis, after reading people like Spencer and Shakespeare and Milton and Chaucer, began to conclude God is, if I may say it, very unscrupulous in the way he tries to capture us. What happened next was, for Lewis, he had several friends that he met at Oxford when he was a don. And they were Roman Catholics like J.R.R. Tolkien and Anglicans like Hugh Dyson. And the men would get together and share their literature, share their writings, share their humor and their nonsense. But Lewis slowly began to move into the camps of theism. And one of the most significant nights was in September 1931, when he would walk on a place called Addison Way at Magdalen College. And next you find that as he walked along this tree-laden place in September with the leaves rushing around, they began to debate the myth of the dying God. Now, Lewis found it very acceptable to believe that there were gods like Osiris and the corn god, the wheat god, all of these gods, Balder the Beautiful, who die and then come back to life. It was a wonderful myth. But with Jesus, he had problems. But here, Hugh Dyson and J.R.R. Tolkien began to persuade him that this idea of the dying God as a myth may have happened once historically. It may have actually been a fact. And so you have the myth become fact. And as they were walking along this tree-laden path, Addison's Way, all of a sudden there was a rush of wind. There was the Ruah, the Pneuma, the Spiritus, the raising up of leaves that began to kind of stop Lewis. Now, next we look at Colbert, and he began to look at the portrait of a young actor as an atheist. He had moved from Hampton-Sydney to Northwestern University, and he was very depressed about his atheism, but he dressed in black, and he would kind of wander around with that kind of angst that actors always have, and that kind of gothic gloominess that is there. But he was depressed about it, he said, the idea that he was an atheist, because it made him realize that he wanted the idea to see his father and brothers again. And it was heartbreaking to think that it would never happen. And so what we see happening to him next is that he's in Chicago, and he's walking down by the lake, and in this frozen winter weather, there's a man that comes up to him and hands him a Gideon Bible. And it's frozen shut, but his pages are kind of cracked with ice, and he opens it up, and he opens to Matthew 5, and it says, if you're having problems, read this. If you're having kind of a bout of anxiety, read Matthew, where Jesus says, who among you can change a hair of your head? And it began to speak to him and began to read the Bible. And at the same time, he walked into a comedy club, and he began to realize that laughter was something that liberated him from this angst. And so he came to faith and to comedy almost simultaneously. It was a true vocation. Next, he began to choose St. Peter as his favorite saint because of all of St. Peter's flaws. Peter blows it time and time again in the gospel. And we look at the Gospel of Mark, where we find kind of the young writer, Mark, who probably listened to all of Peter's stories. And Colbert said, basically, I suck as a Catholic, but that doesn't mean that I don't keep practicing the faith, that I learn. And so humor became part of his life, much like it was a mark of the Gospel of Mark. Now, next we find that both of them, as they became Christians, affirmed the central Orthodox doctrines of the Apostles' Creed and mere Christianity. They believed what the church had always taught and what scripture and tradition taught. Next, we find they both have a similarity of a tremendous photographic memory. Colbert could call quotes from books that he had read when he had guests on his Comedy Central show. And C.S. Lewis was amazing because people could sit in his office and begin a quote from Spenser's Faerie Queene, and he would complete it. Or you would take a poet like Coleridge or Wordsworth. He was able to kind of recall the poetry and the literature that you began. Next, both became public intellectuals and philosophical bullies. Lewis would debate in the Socratic Club. He was not afraid to go into any arena and begin to defend the faith, whether on the BBC or before crowds during World War II. He would go and he would confront people that thought otherwise. And Stephen Colbert, on his Comedy Central program, would basically deal with people straight on, with various agnostics and atheists and anyone who was against the faith. Now, next we find as philosophical bullies, Lewis would even bully his old friends. He said Tolkien was a smooth, pale, fluent little chap who only needs a smack or so now and then. And for his friend Charles Williams, who he often described as looking somewhat like a monkey, you see his photo down there on the far right, he said he's ugly. U-G-L-Y, he's ugly. But those what good friends would do. Likewise, next, Colbert could utterly decimate guests on his program. In fact, there's a story, House Representative Lynn Westmoreland came on his program and was talking about the need for the Ten Commandments to be posted in schools, in courts, and everywhere. And so Colbert asked him, he said, well, can you name the Ten Commandments? And Westmoreland said, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal. And Colbert responded, well, we first need to learn the Ten Commandments, don't we? Next, we find that other friends like him, Amy Sedaris, recognized what she called the bully bull Taurus in Colbert. He would confront anything that he saw as cant or hypocrisy. In fact, next, when you look at the Colbert Report show, it opened with this wonderful bravado of all of these kinds of terms, of patriot, of invincible, star-spangled, all beef. But there was one word that was thrown on that was almost inscrutable for secular audiences, and that was sanctified. What is Colbert saying? And he uses this indirect communication to kind of sneak in theological ideas. Next, both celebrated male camaraderie. Male friendship is very essential to the male psyche's health. You need male friends with whom you can mock and debate and tease. And there are different kinds of love for men with men and men with women. And here you want to have this kind of filial friendship in which ideas can be expressed without a fear of offending anybody else. Next, we find Lewis also defined first friends and second friends. First friends are those with whom you have the same interests, whether it's stamp collecting, golf, or literature, and you agree on almost everything. But then there are second friends. Second friends are the kind of people with whom you have the same interest, but you're approaching it totally different. It is, Lewis suggests in the book called The Four Loves, like a wife. The two of you agree because that's what brought you together. You're friends there, but your perspectives are totally different. Now, next we find that Lewis did go with his friends called the Inklings at pubs like the Eagle and the Child, where they would sit in the back rooms and they would read their literature and they would share ideas. In fact, next we find kind of this image of Lewis with the Inklings at the Eagle and Child. And we find that it is Anthony Hopkins who plays him in the movie Shadowlands. Unfortunately, he's also cast as Hannibal Lecter. And so C.S. Lewis and Hannibal Lecter are the same thing. But hope comes out of that. When you go next, you see that Hopkins has finally become the Pope. And so he plays all three roles. Unfortunately, Hannibal Lecter still kind of lingers in our imagination. And the other two are kind of messed up by that. Both next had a friendship with J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, a friendship with Tolkien for Lewis was something that he would meet with him regularly for beer and beef at one of the pubs or at tea rooms. And their colleges, Merton and Magdalen, were so close together that they would go to different places and meet. In fact, next we find that in Lewis's science fiction trilogy, the Pelandra series, the hero of it is a philologist, which Tolkien was too, whose name is Ransom. Elwyn, the elf friend Ransom. And there's a lot about Ransom that reminds us of Tolkien. And so the two become kind of equated in Lewis's. In fact, it was Tolkien who ransomed Lewis's life and basically introduced him to the Lord Jesus Christ and salvation. And so he becomes a ransom in another way. Tolkien returned the favor next. When you go to his Lord of the Rings, there is this wonderful character, Treebeard. And Treebeard sounds like this blustering C.S. Lewis. In fact, next, even Peter Jackson's film, The Lord of the Rings, when you find a tree, I am no tree, I am an ent. You get a sense of what C.S. Lewis was like, not only in his lectures, but in his tutorials, where he would scare everything, including knowledge, out of his two T's. Now, next we come to Colbert's connection to Tolkien. And he was on the cover of Entertainment magazine, both as Gandalf and Bilbo, kind of dressed in these wonderful disguises. But next on his program, he identified himself as the ultimate Tolkien nerd. As Peter Jackson, the director of the films, himself said of Colbert in Entertainment Weekly, Colbert is not a geek, he is the king geek. He is the great nerd of all nerds. In fact, one of my favorite programs came next when he debated James Franco on the literature of Tolkien. And Franco came on with his kind of chutzpah and arrogance, and he said he wanted to have another Tolkien showdown. And Colbert says, last time you were here, we had a Tolkien showdown. I smoked you like a ham. And it went on next. And Franco says, well, I've been rereading the Silmarillion. And he says, name me just two of the Valar. And Colbert responds, do you want the valor of water, Olmo? Or do you want the hunter of the Valar, Orome? Or do you want the valor of the trees, Yavanna? Or do you want the craftsman of the Valar, Orle? Or do you want his wife, Varda, called Ebereth by the elves who kindled the stars? Or do you want the lord of the airs, Manwë? And next, Colbert ended, you come into my house and challenge me on Tolkien, get out of here. Next, we find that both of them performed as ironic satirists. For Lewis, it was as the devil Screwtape. He took on a Kierkegaardian persona, this second voice in which he spoke ironically. And for him, it was the hardest writing he ever did, this kind of itch to turn things inside out and upside down, where God above becomes the enemy and the devil becomes our father below. But it was through this he was able to communicate indirectly many of his thoughts. For Colbert, next, his strong Roman Catholic and biblical roots on social justice came through as his persona on the Colbert Report. And what he would do is make Christians look at ourselves. In fact, Jim Wallace, the editor of the Sojourners magazine, said essentially he was a Hebrew prophet. And he said, let us take a look at ourselves. Look at the mirror and see us. And so he identified with us, but made us confront who we were. In fact, next we find one of his greatest confrontations is when he was talking to the Congress, or he said, if this is going to be a Christian nation that doesn't help the poor, either we have to pretend that Jesus was just as selfish as we are, or we've got to acknowledge that he commanded us to love the poor and serve the needy without condition. And then we must admit that we just don't want to do it. And so Colbert and Lewis would turn us back to the fundamentals of the Christian faith. It's lived theology. For Lewis, it was on the BBC that he first gave Mere Christianity and told us that God is love and that God's love works through men especially through this whole community of Christians. Now, what that did next was create suspicion for both of these characters. And both of them were viewed suspiciously by other Christians, often for smoking, drinking, and naughty language, or political views. In fact, there is the great story of Bob Jones Jr., the fundamentalist, who went over to Oxford and actually sat down and chatted with C.S. Lewis. And he came back and he said, "That man may smoke, that man may drink, that man is still a Christian." Or there's the story of the teetotaler who came upon a group drinking and admonished them. He said, "I would rather commit adultery than drink what you are drinking." To which the retort came, "So would we, but we have to be satisfied with our beer." Now, Lewis was looked down upon, but so was Colbert. Nevertheless, next, both of them had these pulpits. Lewis would often give sermons at the University Church at St. Mary's in Oxford, where he gave sermons like Learning in Wartime, or his greatest sermon ever, The Weight of Glory, where he sees that our neighbor is most sacred next to God himself. And Colbert on Comedy Central and now The Late Show, they have their pulpits. And like all human beings, sometimes they misspeak from the pulpits, but they still proclaim the faith. What they do next is what I enjoy, is they both mock the apostate hierarchy of the church, particularly the Episcopal Church when it goes astray and it does too much. And I'm an Episcopal. And so you find in The Great Divorce by C.S. Lewis some very hip and fashionable Anglican clergy who follow culture rather than tradition and scripture and the Holy Spirit. Next, Colbert would satirize the same arrogant Episcopalians. In fact, when one would come on and say, joining the Episcopal Church is like advanced placement religion. It's for thinking people. And Colbert would retort, "So I guess that means that atheism is for people smart enough to test out of it." And so the arrogance of Episcopalians would come through. But next, both of them would celebrate the Jewish foundation of the faith. And this is so important when anti-Semitism raises its ugly head. And Colbert would recognize that which was Jewish and see Jesus was a Jew and all the disciples were Jewish and the people who wrote the New Testament were Jewish. Lewis next, too, would also write his reflections on the Psalms, where he tried to understand the Hebrew mindset and this kind of joy and buoyancy and the energy, the fecundity of the Psalms. And he would see in the Jewish gratitude for God a model for all of us. In fact, next we find that Lewis in 1933 would write letters denouncing the Nazi leader, Adolf Hitler, as he came to power. And this is way before Kristallnacht, or before everything that Hitler did. But he would see the fascism of the National Socialist Party in Germany as something that was intrinsically evil. And he would write it into his fiction, even his first kind of fictional allegory, The Pilgrim's Regress, where these fascists are there. And he sees what is coming. He is prophetic in that sense. Next, he wrote in The Great Divorce, he celebrated a great Jewish saint, Sarah Smith, an ordinary woman that is followed and celebrated by the angels and by all of her pets. And later he will marry the Jewish author who becomes converted by his writing, Joy Davidman. Colbert next would deal with kind of the Jewish idea in a different way. And it was his Yahweh or No Way segment. Yahweh was that which was divine, which we could recognize that God was actually involved in. And No Way was, this is not of the scriptures and not of the Christian tradition. For example, Moses at the burning bush was Yahweh. The Wizard of Oz is No Way. And so he looks at different things going on in the church and he says either Yahweh or No Way. One of the things he looked at was a news report about a minister who was recommending that his parishioners have sex 7 days a week. And so he performed a sex experiment on the roof of his church where he and his wife were in a bed. And Colbert said, wait a minute, this is the church, this is the steeple, no, that's not the steeple. That's something else. And he says, you can't look inside and see what's going on here. And he said, and we know this is not Yahweh, this is no way, because God said at least on the seventh day, you need to rest. Next, we find that both have rebranded or retranslated the Christian faith for their generations. In other words, they have opened up the windows of the gospel. They have shown us the love of God with a fresh breeze coming in. And particularly, both of them bring in this original virtue that we've seen many lectures ago of hilaritas, of hilarity, of joyful cheerfulness and gratitude for what God and what Jesus Christ have done. Next, we find that even the Wall Street Journal recognizes the impact of this rebrand, because Lewis's little book, Mere Christianity, has gotten a global amen, selling over 3.5 million copies in English. And now it is in Korean and Japanese and Chinese and Polish and all of these other issues. Next, we find they both debated with those who disagreed with them. We mentioned Lewis started a debating club in Somerville College, the all-women's college. And so he was one of those male Oxford dons which would go and actually engage in women scholars and build them up, not as kind of a chauvinist who stayed away from helping them. But Colbert on the Colbert Report, now he had this one argument with an atheist, Philip Zimbardo, who wrote The Lucifer Effect. And his idea was that God created hell. Paradoxically, it was God who created hell, he said, as a place to put Lucifer and his angels. And had he not created hell, evil would not exist. And Colbert just looks at him as one of the great early church fathers would. And he said, basically, what happened was Satan used his own free will as an angel and he abused it by disobeying authority. Hell was created by Satan's disobedience to God, and so he was purposely removed from God's love by his own choice. And next, he began to argue even more. Evil exists not because God invented hell, but because of the disobedience of Satan. God gave Satan, the angels, and man free will, which is what hell is, removing yourself from God's love. You send yourself to hell. God never sends anyone to hell. God does not send anyone there. If you say, I don't want you, God, you are rejecting heaven. Now, next, what that got to was his guest condescension to Colbert. And Zimbardo says, well, obviously, you learned well in Sunday school, he said, mocking him. But what came next was the best rejoinder. He says, I teach Sunday school, you mother. And so he put Zimbardo back in his place with Zimbardo's language. Next, we find that both men have been celebrated by Time magazine. Lewis in 1942 with his Devil's Screwtape, and his heresy is orthodoxy in a place called Oxford. And then Colbert himself, you begin to see this man who looks funny, but there is this foundation of faith. Now, what that brings to next is what is called the celebrity bump. If you are running for office or you're selling a book, if you use either one of their names, Colbert or Lewis, you will get a bump. You will get extra status. In fact, next we look, and here's Colbert who gives his bump, just even on his show, that when his guests come on, they realize they're going to sell at least one or two more books. Now, the problem of this is that everyone exploits it. So we go next to see that authors are still exploiting the Lewis bump. And unfortunately, I am the author. On the two books on the brackets, Surprised by Laughter, it's all C.S. Lewis. And I made a lot of money off of that book. And the book on the middle is God Mocks. It's a history of religious satire from the Hebrew prophets to Stephen Colbert. So the bump comes out, and maybe the bump will even work today, and I will sell another half a copy, at least, of one book. Let's get out of that, though. Next, both still retain spiritual confessors. For Colbert is Father Jim Martin, Father Jim Martin is his confessor. He is his Jiminy Cricket who will come and speak into his life. And C.S. Lewis had Father Walter Adams. And Walter Adams and he would write letters, and Lewis could confess to him. And I think this is one thing that we Episcopals have lost, that the Roman Catholics have kept. And that is the whole art of confession, that you could go into a priest or someone that you trust and tell every sin that you have. You can begin to kind of confess your vices. And there's something that's so therapeutic and so healing and so liberating and so full of laughter once you do, as having a confessor. Next, we come to the idea that both of them were not afraid to be a fool for Christ. And Lewis in Oxford was not afraid to really affirm who Jesus Christ was. He wrote in Mere Christianity, a man who was merely a man and said the sort of things that Jesus did would not be just a great moral teacher. He'd be either a lunatic on the level with a man who says he's a poached egg, or else he'd be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. What is amazing is that many people who would go to the Bible or go to Lewis find that reason is the way that they come to faith. They take a leap of faith or a step of faith, but people like Mortimer Adler, the great philosopher, or Pascal, or Malcolm Guite today, or Chuck Colson from Prison Ministries, all of these people began to kind of wrestle with their faith, and they began to realize they had to deal with who Jesus was. Next, we find that both are challenged by the political and educational establishments with who they are, what they stand for. One of my favorite sections in the program was Paul Begala, who was trying to work with Clinton. And Clinton was full of a lot of effusive language and would talk on and on and on. And Begala wanted to teach Clinton how to be very concise and succinct with his ideas so he could sell it. And he said, you need to be like Jesus was. Jesus was very succinct. And Begala was telling Colbert, he says, here, John 3:16. And Colbert just quoted it. For God so loved the world that he who believes on him should not perish but have everlasting life. There, Begala said, 4.5 seconds. And Colbert said, the Christian soundbite. Here you can express your faith in ways that are short and succinct and direct. And Clinton had to learn how to do it. Unfortunately, he learned how to deny his sins in sound bites, but not other things. We get on next. However, both of them had praise of folly. As G.K. Chesterton once said, no reader can accuse me of trying to make a fool of him. I am the fool of my own story, and no rebel shall hurl me from my throne. He became a fool for Christ. And Colbert, too, in the roles that he used to play on the Colbert Report, he was a fool for Christ. And he could be very direct and honest, even as Jesus would look at the Pharisees and say, you look like a whitewashed gravestone, or you look like a cup of coffee after a month. Here are the people who could speak directly and candidly to other people. In fact, next we find that Colbert advised young people, don't be afraid to be a fool. Remember, you cannot be both young and wise. Young people who pretend to be wise to the ways of the world are mostly just cynics. Cynicism masquerades as wisdom, but is the farthest thing from wisdom, because cynics don't learn anything. Cynicism is a self-imposed blindness, a rejection of the world because we are so afraid it will hurt us or disappoint us. Cynics always say no, but saying yes begins saying things. Saying yes is how things grow. Saying yes leads to knowledge. Yes is for young people. So for as long as you have the strength to, say yes. In fact, it is Jesus who comes to us and says, not no, but yes. Next, we find an interview asked Colbert what he would like to ask Pope Francis should the popular pontiff ever agree to sit on the Late Show chair for an interview. And Colbert said that he would applaud this Pope for many things, and he would ask him about being a fool for Christ. What does that mean? Well, next we find that Lewis gets back to that in the 11th letter of the Screwtape Letters. He talks about the kinds of laughter. There is the laughter of joy, which is a reunion with God and with people we have lost. There's the laughter of play and fun, where we just enjoy running and laughing and reading and playing with other people. There's the laughter of the joke proper, which deals with incongruity, but it can go good or bad, and you can lead to vice or to virtue with that joke. But worst of all is the laughter of flippancy, where you laugh at other people, where you demean them and disparage them. For Lewis, he said, the English take their sense of humor so seriously that a deficiency in this sense is almost the only deficiency at which they feel shame. So they have to have a sense of humor. Next, we find that Stephen Colbert conversed with Father Thomas Rosica of Sultan-like Catholic Media. And what they talked about were Lewis's 4 kinds of laughter. And again, they agreed that there are kinds of laughter that God gives us. Next, we get lastly to the idea that both were acquainted with grief. As we started off, we saw that Lewis lost his mother to cancer, and Colbert lost his father and 2 brothers in the plane accident. And so grief was the foundation. But grief was only the beginning, because later in life, Lewis would lose his good friend Charles Williams during the war, and he would lose his wife, who went through a bout with cancer and was miraculously healed for 3 years and then died. And so both of them observed grief. And next we find that both of them, for them, loss was inextricably tied to faith. And it pointed back to Jesus' suffering and telling them how to approach life. In fact, Colbert wrote, he says, that's my context for my existence, is that I'm here to know God, to love God, to serve God, that we might be happy with each other in this world and with him in the next. That's our catechism, he says, and it makes a lot of sense to me. I got that from my mom and my dad and my siblings. Basically, we have learned it from the scriptures and from the church fathers and church mothers who teach us what that is like. And Colbert went on next to say, when I look at the death of my father and brothers, I've learned to love the thing which I most wish had not happened. He says, I didn't want it to happen, but I read a letter from Tolkien, and Tolkien was talking about a tragedy and a grief. And he said, what punishments and what sufferings from God are not gifts? Even death itself is not just the punishment of sin, but death will be a gift that leads us through a door to eternal life. He says, I have learned to love that kind of suffering and to be grateful for it. And it's a paradox, but I can live with both of them together. So next, in the end, both were surprised by joy. For Lewis, joy is the serious business of heaven. For Chesterton, it was too, that Christians have this joy that surpasses what we are going through. And Colbert had a note taped to his computer that read, joy is the most infallible sign of the existence of God. And so they were both surprised by joy. Next, last, I want to thank Bob Anderson, our producer and friend. And he has been here throughout all of this suffering and grief and still joyful. And I go next to kind of a blank screen where I tell you, I come back to me and I tell you one last parable, which is also a joke. And it's my favorite that I've used over and over again, but it gets to the point of all of this history of laughter. And there was a billionaire who invited all of these people down to his estates in Florida. And he showed him everything that he thought was worthwhile and valuable. His antique automobiles, his precious gems, his Renaissance paintings. But he took all of his guests out to the backyard, and there was an Olympic-sized swimming pool filled with alligators. And he said, I value courage. And if any one of you will jump in and swim across this pool. I will give you whatever you want. There was silence and nervousness, and people pulled back away from it. And suddenly there was a young man in the pool, and he was swimming across so fast, his arms splashing at the water, alligator jaws snapping at his heels. He got to the side, he got out, he was sweating and wet and covered. And the billionaire was amazed. He came up and said, "That was amazing, that was stupendous. What do you want?" And the young man, breathing, said, "I want to know who pushed me in." That's what we all want to know. Who pushed us into this pool of crocodiles we call life? It is one who is behind us all and who will give us laughter. It is the one who, through our grief and our suffering, gives Christians throughout history the gift of laughter. And I pray that as we end this series, that you will keep discovering his gift of joy and laughter. Thank you.